the key is making sure you don't just look at the cash flow on the property, but also that you're making sure to go with a good sponsor.
Welcome back to Going Passive. Today we're talking about 1031 exchanges, Delaware Statutory Trust or DSTs, 721 UPREITs, and the transition from active property ownership to more passive real estate strategies. My guest is Andrew Kraffert-Gora, founder of 1031 Capital Advisors. Today's discussion, of course, is for educational purposes only and is not tax, legal, or investment advice. Consult your CPA, attorney, qualified intermediary, and financial professionals regarding your specific situation. Okay, Andrew, tell us who you are and what 1031 Capital Advisors does. And before you do that, please preface it with the disclaimer required by your company.
Yeah, let me start off. I'm going to pull that disclaimer up. So a little bit about 1031 Capital Advisors, who we are. So we're a group of financial advisors that help clients transition from being active landlords into more passive options. We're fiduciary financial advisors, so we have a lot of different options we can show clients. And so to start off, the brokerage that we do our business through is called Concord Investment Services. And so one of the disclaimers they just said for the record are, we offer securities through Concord Investment Services. They're member FINRA, SCIPC, and advisory services are actually through Concord Asset Management and 1031 Capital Advisors. So that's just a little disclaimer. As I mentioned, the fiduciary, I'm licensed Series 66, which is a combination of Series 63 and 65. It's basically the fiduciary license you get. In addition, I'm licensed Series 7, which is basically I'm a general securities license. Besides just advising in DSTs, I can actually advise as well with stocks and bonds and kind of go through all the different options. So although we offer DSTs and REITs, we just like to make sure our clients are going in and knowing that there's other options out there. And so we essentially meet with clients and just show them all the different options and try to stay unbiased and help them into something more passive.
And how did you, this is a unique part of the real estate market. How did you end up specializing in this corner of commercial real estate and 1031 planning?
Yeah, great question. So I actually found myself out of college. I went into commercial real estate and I found many of my clients, this is like in 2021, 22, they'd find themselves with a highly appreciated asset and they were thinking, what can I do with this asset now? I've made all this money and I haven't been keeping up with the rents on the property, but if I were to sell it, I'd take a huge tax hit. So many of my clients decided to look a little bit further into other options, and that's what I would present them. So I'd present them a couple different options, whether that's transitioning more into like a triple net type asset. In addition, I presented possibly seller financing if it made sense, where they basically carry the note and they're almost like the bank. Another option was like charitable remainder trust. And then finally, I'd also present this Delaware Statutory Trust. And I'll get into that in a moment, what that is. But so many of my clients were going into these Delaware Statutory Trusts. And so I decided to actually go get licensed and just focus on the DSTs. And in particular, actually, when looking at the DSTs, I used to refer it to someone else. And when it came to the different sponsor companies or these DST operators, there's some good sponsors and some bad sponsors. And so I once had a client go into a bad sponsor and I would have wished, I was able to find kind of the dirt on that sponsor prior. But unless you're really in the space, you don't know the good sponsors from the bad sponsors. And so I decided to completely transition and just do DSTs full times and become a financial advisor. And so that's pretty much what I've done for the last 4 or 5 years, is just be a full-time DST advisor.
Yes, and you and I have known each other for several years now. I've seen you at all the events, kind of you coming up in the marketing side of the DSTs. Who's the typical person that I know it's similar to my client profile, but who's your typical person that reaches out to you for help?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, my client is someone that's just tired of being a landlord. They're tired of those phone calls. It's funny, many of my clients say, hey, I retired from my actual work, but I never truly retired. It seems every time I go on vacation, I get a phone call or a pipe breaks or a toilet has an issue. And so Most of my clients, what I say, they want to truly retire. And that's what they do with the DST model. Because even with hiring property managers, sometimes they tell me that's kind of like a glorified answering system, in the sense that the tenant tells my property manager that the property manager tells me. So at the end of the day, I still have to do the heavy lifting. And so my clients are looking for a truly passive option, and there's a couple different options available, and I go through the pros and cons of each one.
Yeah, that certainly makes a lot of sense. A lot of the owners that I'm working with are in a similar situation. A lot of times investors, they invest in these properties and they don't realize they're investing in a job, a job, because it does require a lot of work. It's not truly passive. So, when someone is thinking about selling their property, or a broker is thinking about representing a client, why should owners and brokers understand what options are out there on the passive side before listing a property?
Yeah, so I tell people to plan it out before listing, because sometimes they don't realize what they're eligible for or not eligible. And what I mean by that is, sometimes I've had clients tell me, hey Andrew, I'm looking to sell this duplex, and let's say they have a loan on the building. They didn't realize, but now that they're retired, they're not eligible for a loan on another property, right? And so this is an issue I've seen happen to one of my clients. Luckily, with some of the products we work with, such as like the DSTs, there's non-recourse debt on the property level, so you don't have to go and get a loan yourself. And so planning is always the key. Is just making sure you're planning out the transition so you're not stressed during the process, because there is a timeline, and we can talk about that timeline as well with the 1031 process. Some of my clients invest into passive strategies with me initially just to kind of get a feel for it. There's also lower minimums, and then decide to do a 1031 exchange with their asset. But that's what I see for the most part. Is you want to make sure you plan it, understand how the investment works, get comfortable with it, and then you can decide to transition, whether that's into like a REIT vehicle, which we work with, Real Estate Investment Trust, or a DST, Delaware Statutory Trust, and we'll hop into the differences and the pros and cons as well.
Yeah, and along those lines, what about the angle of the capital gains tax? A lot of clients, when they call me, they don't really think about the capital gains. They don't think about how big of a hit is. I mean, isn't it a recommendation definitely that they sit down with their CPA before listing the property and go through these options?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've actually seen this not as much in California as maybe other states, where the person doesn't have much appreciation, but they've owned the asset a very long time. And so what they'll have is what we call the hidden tax. And the hidden tax is depreciation recapture. So I just had this call earlier today. A client sold a property in Maryland, and she was looking at the numbers. She bought it for roughly $1 million a long time ago, and now she's selling it for like $1.5 million. And she's thinking, well, $500,000, that's not much. But she didn't realize she depreciated that whole asset, and the government wants the 25% depreciation recapture. So on that note, she was going to owe a lot more taxes than she thought, because she was doing all her analysis just based off of federal, and her state capital gains. So I tell people always, even when we're going through the DST process or the 1031 process, I always tell people just check in with their CPA to see, how much they're going to owe in taxes. Some clients have carry forward losses too that they didn't realize that they have, so maybe they take a little bit of money out of their exchange. And so I've seen that too. And so I always like to sit down. First step is just asking clients, what are your goals? What does what would be the perfect scenario for you? And they usually tell me, 10% cash flow as well as appreciation, which I'd start toning it back and letting them know, well, so now let's look at what's realistic, and we'll go through kind of, the different cap rates, or essentially the cash flows with the properties. Because just like your traditional real estate, usually when there's a higher yield with even a DST, there's also going to be probably a little bit more risk associated with that, whether the asset class is a little bit more cyclical, and we go through all that with the clients when we sit down.
Yeah, and there's certainly additional taxes. There's that 3+% Medicare tax, right? And, they always gripe about having to pay us 3%, but then they're paying Uncle Sam 3% for doing nothing. But yeah, there are a lot of taxes. Definitely, we always recommend visiting with your CPA, your tax professional, go through all those numbers before listing the property. Now, you've talked a lot about 1031 exchanges. Not everybody knows what a 1031 exchange is, so maybe you could break down a 1031 exchange kind of in plain English and tell our listeners, what the basics are.
Yeah, so great question, and definitely the fundamental and what most clients are doing when they sell a property. A 1031 exchange is a way to sell one investment property and then go into another investment property without paying taxes. Now, a common misconception is you must go from your property into that same type of property that you sold. You can actually go from your property into other asset classes as long as it's investment real estate. And what I mean by that is if you sell an apartment building, you can go out and buy an industrial building, or you could buy a hotel, or you could even buy mineral rights or air rights. There's a lot of options as long as it's considered real property and held for investment use. Another thing when it comes to that 1031 process, one of the key things I sadly see is people forget to set up a qualified intermediary. So they hear about this 1031 idea and they think, oh, that's great, I'm going to use that one day. And then they never tell the realtor, I would like to do a 1031 exchange, and they sell their property and now they become a taxpayer. The key is you want to set up that 1031 exchange before you sell. And then once you sell, you actually have a time window that you must meet, which is 45 days to identify, and then a total of 180 days for the whole exchange. And so that's 45 plus another 135. But the key timeline is set it up before you close, and then 45 days for the identification.
Yeah, and I'd like to tack on to that. Absolutely, every broker and agent out there should be talking to their clients about setting up a 1031, because it always comes down to the 11th hour. We've got one closing next Monday, and I've talked to everybody about the 1031 exchange, and now they're just setting it up. So certainly as brokers, agents, any sort of advisors, we should be helping our clients get ahead of that process, because it really makes it difficult when it's the last 5 or 6 days of the 45-day transaction and they're jumping through hoops to set up that 1031 exchange. People often talk about deferring their taxes indefinitely on a 1031 exchange, the old swap till you drop. What should they understand about that concept of deferring indefinitely?
Yeah, so the best way to actually think about it is every time you're doing a 1031, you're just deferring paying the taxes. And another thing misconception that people don't realize is when you go and sell a property for $1 million and you buy the exact same amount of real estate for $1 million, your actual basis follows with you. And so you don't get a new basis unless you buy more real estate, whether that's with a loan. As long as you're buying more real estate, then you get additional depreciation on that new amount. But with a 1031 exchange, you're just deferring it. Now the key is, and you said swap till you drop, that's what I would say most investors do, and the goal is, keep doing 1031s until one day you pass away, which is a big price to pay, but you get a stepped up basis for your heirs. And that's a really key part of this whole thing, is getting that stepped up in basis, because it's sad to see, someone go through their whole life, and I've seen this, someone's 86 years old and they want to take care and plan for their children and sell the assets, now, and not have their kids have to worry about that. But the problem is now they're paying all this in tax at the very last minute, when it would have been a little bit smarter maybe to do a 1031 into a product maybe a little more passive, whether that's a triple net property or a DST or one of those REIT options. Because once you've done the 1031 exchange, when you pass away, you actually get that stepped up in basis. Just like if you have your typical brokerage account, you get that stepped up in basis. So it's really key to do 1031s. In addition, if you're in California, which I'm here in San Diego, California, we're a community property state. And on that note, so even when your spouse passes away, you actually get a stepped up basis as well. So key to 1031s and selling real estate is also, checking in with your CPA, talking through the 1031, making sure they, tell you what the taxes are, because that's usually when I see someone not do a 1031, it's because they thought they were going to pay a little amount in taxes, and that's usually not the case.
Yeah, and I must say, when you think about passing away, the true step up as you and I both know, Andrew is having a relationship with Jesus Christ. I thought I would just use this as an opportunity to throw that in there.
No, definitely.
So when you think about some of the common timeline mistakes, timelines are a huge issue, especially on our side, on the broker side. What are some of the items that investors should be concerned with when doing a 1031 exchange on timelines?
Yeah, so the most important timeline, as I mentioned, is setting up the 1031 exchange prior to closing, showing that you had intent to set that up, and you actually use what's called a qualified intermediary. And I always tell people, if you're looking to do an exchange, tell your agent. Oftentimes their agents will put it in the listing as well. And so the biggest thing is just let everyone know of your intentions when it comes to utilizing a 1031. Something that people don't always think of as well is you can do what's called a partial 1031. And what a partial 1031 is, let's say you have a $2.1 million property and you'd like to pay taxes just on just $100,000, you can exchange the other $2 million. And sometimes clients of mine do that just to have a rainy day fund, or maybe they want to go, buy their spouse a new car, and that is something that you could do. Of course, consult with your CPA, but I have clients do that all the time. They do what we call a partial 1031. And another thing is, once you sell, so the date that you close, you have 45 days to identify what properties you'd like to go into. And there's a couple rules you have to follow with that. I'm not going to get into those, but the most common rule is the 3 property rule, stating that you list any 3 properties, any values, and then you must go into one of those properties if you're going to do a 1031 exchange. You can't buy something that you haven't identified. Now, another thing I should mention, which people are sometimes worried about identifying early, is during the 45-day period, you can actually change your identification. So you could identify a property and say, I want to buy this one. And then 10 days later, in that 45-day window, say, actually, I changed my mind. I want to buy something else. I usually recommend clients, if you aren't going into a DST or something passive with us that's pretty seamless to close, I usually recommend trying to get under contract if it's like a real property, like a triple net property or another duplex, triplex, physical property that you're going to go buy yourself. I usually recommend trying to get under contract on it so that it's a real option. And what I mean by real option is I've seen people identify in the 45 days, then send an offer, and then their offer doesn't get accepted. And now they have what we call a blown 1031 exchange. And so I can't stress it enough, trying to make sure to send out LOIs, get an actual offer approved before that 45-day window is up. The worst thing you can do, which happens somehow very commonly, is clients of mine will go on vacation day 1 of their 45 days. And 45 days seems like a lot of time, but it really isn't when it comes to real estate. These are 45-day calendar days, not 45 business days. So that's something to note as well.
Yeah, it goes very quick. This might be a good time to tell our listeners that I do a full webinar, which includes a very detailed talk by Bill Exeter of Exeter 1031 Exchange Services. If you're interested in that webinar, it's free to attend. Just go down into the link in the description and visit the 1031 Exchange webinar and passive investment webinar that I do with Bill. And we cover all of these items in detail. Bill's the best. He knows the most. He's basically written the book, which will provide a copy of that book from the webinar if you're interested. Check it out. Let's shift gears a little bit. We covered a lot on the 1031 exchange. Tell me what a UPREIT is, or a 721 UPREIT, and why do you describe it as a one-way door?
Yeah, so great question. So the 721 UPREIT, it stands for Umbrella Partnership REIT, and it's a really creative way to go from real property into really a security. And so you're able to go from, owning traditional real estate into a portfolio, aka a REIT, of a real estate investment trust. And so what a 721 actually is you're able to do a 1031 into a DST because of 2004-86. That's a revenue ruling that the IRS says you can do a 1031 into a DST. It got blessed by the IRS. And then that DST then does a 721 exchange into the REIT. And the mechanics that are really happening is they're saying, hey, you're giving this property to the REIT, and we're now going to give you, shares of the REIT. And so you get a proportion, of course, of however much you invested as proportion in the REIT. So that's the mechanics. I know it sounds complex, but it's a way to go essentially from traditional real estate, whether that's a condo or an apartment building, an industrial building, into a portfolio. And these are usually multi-billion-dollar portfolios with some of the biggest institutions in the world. Some of the groups we work with, they manage trillions of dollars with a T. So we have extensive list of different REIT providers or 721 providers, and so we'll show you what they're currently doing. Some of the groups we work with actually have data centers as well in the REIT, so you basically get a basket of goods in the REITs. Now, depending on what REIT you go into, you could decide to do just a multifamily only REIT, or you could decide to do a REIT that focuses on industrial and multifamily, while other REITs might have a bigger basket of goods. And so we'll talk through the pros and cons of each REIT. And as a financial advisor, I'm not tied to any one of these groups or the DST option or the REIT option. My goal is to tell you the pros and cons of each option. And I think that could be a good segue of kind of showing and explaining what the pros and cons are with the DST option and the REIT option. And kind of the pro of the DST option is it keeps your 1031 intact. And this answers your question why it's considered a one-way door. A DST, you keep your 1031 intact, and in the future you can 1031 back into the market. And I have clients do that. They tell me, Andrew, I want something passive right now because I got a good offer on my property, or I'm just tired of the headaches. But 7 years down the road, I'd like to be able to go buy my grandson his dream home. It's going to be an investment property, which later he inherits, right? And so I see that frequently, and that's a traditional DST. You keep your 1031 intact. You can exchange in the future. The one-way door aspect of the 721, what you're doing is you're going from a 1031 into a DST that then gets absorbed into a REIT. And when you're in that REIT, you're in that multi-billion-dollar portfolio, but whenever you sell out, you're now under partnership law. Hence why it's called umbrella partnership REIT or UPREIT. And so with that, when you take money out, it falls under partnership law, and so you can't go and do a 1031 since you're in a partnership. But there are some tax advantages of being in a partnership. The most popular one that CPAs often recommend their client to do is under partnership law, you can take out your cost basis first. And what that means is, let's say you bought a property for $500,000 and now it's worth $800,000 and you had it for 3 years, right? This is just a short-term example. And you have roughly $500,000 left as your cost basis. You could exchange all $800,000 into a REIT, and then later on down the road, whenever you decide, most of these REITs are quarterly liquid, you could pull out your money, the basis, tax-free. And so that's a popular tax option. But depending on if you have any basis left, it can provide some advantages in the REIT. I don't want to go too much into the REIT, but there's a lot of pros and cons with DSTs and REITs, and I'll turn it back to you I know I can go a little long-winded on some of these.
Well, and in full disclosure, folks, Andrew's very regulated, being a financial advisor by FINRA, by his company. So there's only so much we can discuss, but I'm going to put his contact information down below, of course, in the description. And I encourage you to reach out to him and schedule a one-on-one appointment, either, via phone, locally there in San Diego, or by Zoom. So just in full disclosure, we're pretty scripted here, if you haven't noticed. So let's shift gears a little bit. We'll go into the Delaware Statutory Trust. Tell us what a Delaware Statutory Trust, or DST, actually is and how it fits within somebody's portfolio.
Yeah, so what a DST is, it's a way to own fractional interest in large institutional building. As I just mentioned in reference a moment ago, it is a way that you keep your 1031 exchange intact. So in the future, you can still do 1031s. But what you're actually owning, as of course it says, Delaware Statutory Trust, you're actually owning beneficial interest in a trust which owns a property. And the bright side of that is you reduce your liability, and you're also gaining access to institutional properties. So you're actually getting access to And you get to decide what type of property you go into, whether that's a multifamily building, maybe a self-storage asset, a data center, an industrial. There's a lot of options out there, and we kind of try to match that right option for you. There's also triple net properties and DSTs as well.
Yeah, and what are some of the real-world trade-offs investors should understand before considering a DST, Andrew?
Yeah, so when looking at DSTs, I usually tell people it's more of a stay rich investment than a get rich. And what I mean by that is most of these DSTs are like Class A buildings, or when you're looking at triple net, they're like the A tier tenants for the most part. And so you'll have very large institutions as a tenants compared to if you were to go buy a property here locally, you can kind of do that value add aspect. And so you can maybe add a little bit more value, but with the DSTs, these are kind of turnkey assets. And many of you investors out there might understand the concept of just a turnkey, brand new build, brand new development, might not have as much yield compared to a property that maybe not as much yield as a property like here in San Diego, but with these DSTs, surprisingly, because they are institutional properties, they trade more off cap rates compared to like here in San Diego, something might trade at a much lower cap rate because people are using it for their own homes, or they're really banking on the appreciation.
Well, and also I think in my experience, one of the biggest trade-offs my clients who are actively managing have to consider is the fact that they're going to have no control. And for some of them, having no control over the decisions that affect their investment is difficult for them. So I think one of the things that investors should consider is, are you willing to give up the control? But when you give up that control, you're also giving up the headaches of the terrible T's of telephone calls and the things we discussed earlier. So
yeah, you won't be getting phone calls from DSTs by any means, but there's also tax advantages of being completely passive, but that's for another day.
Sure. And what are some of the biggest risks people need to understand, not just the benefits?
Yeah, so I would say the number one risk I see is picking a bad sponsor. And that's, before I got into this space, I used to just refer my business to a DST advisor, and he kind of just placed clients into the highest yielding DST and didn't explain the trade-offs. And what I mean by that is every now and then, like right now, we have a DST that's 7.5% cash flow. And many clients just look at that and go, oh, I want the 7.5% cash flow. That's amazing. That's way better than the 5% the other one's paying, right? And that's net of everything. But with the 7.5%, there's more to that. And what I mean by that, there might be a short-term loan, like a 5-year term loan, or there might be a short-term lease, and it's going to be turning over. And if they can't re-tenant it, now you're going to have a problem with the building. So the key is making sure you don't just look at the cash flow on the property, but also that you're making sure to go with a good sponsor. One of my clients actually invested into a DST, not when I was an advisor, but prior. I was helping them as a realtor, and I was just saying, hey, here's this guy, talk to him about DSTs. He talked to him, and they had a DST here in San Diego, and I was thinking, well, if it's in San Diego, it's probably tough to go wrong. Mentally, that's what I was thinking, but it turns out they went with a bad sponsor group, and there's only a handful of bad sponsors out there, but the bad sponsors will charge miscellaneous fees. They might hire sub-companies to run the property that are also owned by them, and they might, hike up the fees as well on that. And so I always tell clients, look for companies that have proven track records, right? Full cycle events. Ask them if they've ever had a bad deal or how their current deals are performing. So questions like that. But I'm here to kind of be the quarterback in that process and help advise the pros and cons. And even our broker dealer, they do their own level of due diligence too. We usually hire a couple third-party groups to kick the bricks per se and go out there. And we also do background checks into the sponsors who run are actually running the property. So there's multiple checks and balances, but the biggest thing is pick the right sponsor, then make sure to pick the right asset class, because you got to think about natural disasters as well, right? And those do happen. And so whether you're buying out of state. There could be, in Florida, I know a lot of DSTs had their insurance premiums go up, right, when we had a bunch of hurricanes. So things of that nature, you just have to be cognizant of. I'm a big fan of diversifying and multiple DSTs, and that's easy to do. So you could buy some multifamily, you could buy some senior housing, and it's really easy to diversify in DSTs, which I recommend my clients to do all the time, especially because, we've had a trend of naturally in our lives putting all our money or eggs into one property, and it's better to have multiple properties, especially if you don't have to do the heavy lifting and the answering of the phone calls.
Yeah, and one part of the trade-off is that there needs to be some debt replacement. If you do a 1031 exchange, if you have debt or leverage on the property, that needs to be replaced. How does that work with a DST?
Yeah, so with DSTs, I mentioned a little bit, they're actually non-recourse loans on the property level. So they're not going to come to you and do a credit check or anything of that nature. It's funny, I just had a client last week that came to me and said, Andrew, my credit's down a little bit. Are we going to have any issues with the DST? And I told him, oh, no, it's a non-recourse loan. So even if the property goes under, they're not going to come after you. You're not personally guaranteeing it. And actually, for some clients, it improves their credit score because it's not on, underneath their name. So with a DST, again, it's a property level loan. And another thing I should note, which is really advantageous, is these institutional sponsors, some of the biggest companies out there, are getting these loans on their balance sheet first, and then on the property level, right? And so they can get loans at much better rates than the average consumer. I mean, some of the DSTs in the market right now are like the average, I would say, is from 4.7% interest rate to about 5.6% interest rate, while your typical consumer, in July of 2026 might be at 6.5% or 7% if they were to go get, commercial type loan or residential type loan. So you're generally positively leveraged in DSTs, which helps your overall return, and that's something I can go into more. But I highly recommend my clients investing in DSTs and replacing the debt portion in DSTs. I actually work with a lot of realtors and commercial brokers and triple net brokers that come to me and just for the debt. They say, hey, we have a plan for the reinvestment. We're selling this 18-unit apartment. They'd like to buy a 4-unit, so they kind of still hold on to real estate and then just put the debt portion elsewhere because they don't want to have to worry about that, hanging over their head. So there's a lot of flexibility, and we match up the debt with a different DST. So if you need 50% loan to value, we'll show you DSTs with 50% loan to value. If you need about roughly 30% loan to value, and when I say 30% loan to value, let's say you had $1 million asset and a $300,000 loan that you need to replace. And so we can help match that up for your exchange.
Yeah, in my experience, that's been the beauty of the DSTs, is the fact that there's so many options out there across the country to invest in, and you could really find that unique, specific property or investment to fit for that specific client, which has been nice. And I know we've been able to, like you mentioned before, utilize them where they're not the primary investment vehicle. Maybe they are going into another piece of real estate and they had leftovers and they didn't want to take any boot or any cash and pay taxes on it. So they were able to plug into a DST that maybe had a minimum investment that fit within their parameters. Tell us about a real world experience or example that you've had where planning ahead helped save a 1031 exchange. I'm sure you have a bunch of them. I know I have a bunch of them, but how has it saved one of your clients' 1031 exchange from blowing up?
Yeah, great question. And right before I answer that, I actually want to mention I actually personally own a couple DSTs, and part of the reason being is when I was 10 years ago, I was in school and I was trying to get started in real estate, so I bought some properties out in like Memphis, Tennessee. Right, you only had to put about $5,000 down. It was easy, and I made money doing so. But the hassle on paper, it was a great return. But on a $60,000, $50,000 asset, it was just wasn't worth my time. So I always tell people also value your time when you're thinking about your return, especially for smaller assets. So I sold my assets, did a 1031 into DSTs, and now I gain back my time. And I'm able to enjoy my life a little bit more rather than dealing with, the whole Tennessee system, which was a headache for me to do personally. And I also don't have to be an expert anymore, right? Anytime I try to find a property in a new market out of state, I always try to how to find that right neighborhood, right? And real estate is a neighborhood by neighborhood type thing. And with the DSTs, the sponsors are doing all that heavy lifting for you, right? You have some of the biggest institutions going out and picking those properties. But to answer your question, how did we save a failing exchange? The biggest thing is sometimes I get pulled into these at the very end of someone's 45-day window. And what I mean by that is someone sold their property and they're looking, locally for another property, and they just can't find something that they like, right? And so I helped a client save their exchange because they were trying to buy here locally again, and he actually identified 2 properties, and we did a DST as a backup. And so I told him, hey, you have that third option, you have 3 things you can identify, might as well put a DST just because it doesn't hurt to use that spot since you haven't identified anything else. When he told me, Andrew, I'm really thinking I'm going to buy this office building. It's over in Carlsbad by his house. He liked the investment. It all made sense. And what ended up happening was while under contract, he found out that 2 things. A, there ended up being a crack in the foundation, which he thought he could get over. And then B, he found out there was like 6 of the AC units on top of it as well needed to be replaced, and it was expensive capital expenditure essentially. And the seller at the time, this was in 2022, wasn't really willing to give him any credit because he knew he was in a 1031. Hence why he said, I accepted your offer versus the other gentleman. But the client came back to him and said, well, I thought the property was going to be in good condition. A cracked slab, AC units, this is going to be over $100,000 of repairs alone, and that's on the low end, right? And so the seller basically told him to pound sand. You either do it or you're going to pay all the money in taxes. And he never told him that he had a backup option, which was that DST. The other property had already got sold to someone else, so he didn't have that opportunity. But now the client looked at a little bit further into this DST, or he was going to have to pony up that additional cash to fix the property. And so that's a situation where I saved an exchange in the sense that it wasn't, I saved the client, a couple $100,000 of cash because he was getting backed up against a fence. Secondarily, I'll give another example of I had a gentleman, he sold his house up in the Bay Area. It was an investment property, a home that he liked. It was worth about $1.1 million. And what ended up happening is he thought he was going to own this forever. Well, a gentleman came to him and said, my brother and my cousin, they're all the neighbors to that property. He said, I'll give you $1.4 million for it. And he said, well, for $1.4 million, I'd be, it wouldn't be smart not to take that offer. And so he decided to take that offer, but he found himself in a spot where he didn't know where to put the money. And he wasn't really looking to go out and find another property. And that's where I saved the exchange in the sense that he got to that 42, 43 day window, getting ready to pay the tax, and then he decided to actually go into DST. And I've actually seen this many times where people get an extremely high offer, whether that's from someone that just sold their company and it's an investment property, and for some reason the person wants that building, and sometimes people actually pay, what the market value is plus what the person's going to pay in taxes. And I see that sometimes, I don't know why, it's frequent. Like for instance, someone will come to you with an offer and they say, I won't sell it because I have to pay taxes. And the other person will say, well, I'll pay the taxes for you. And so that sometimes happens, and that's where I've had actually 2 cases where the person was just going to pay the tax and then they realized last minute, wait, there's this DST option. But yeah, those are, I guess, some examples of saving a 1031.
Yeah, I've had clients even say going into a transaction that they plan to pay the tax, but once they start getting those estimates from the escrow company and they see what those taxes actually are, state of California pulls their taxes out before you even close, and once they sit down with their CPA and that 35 to 40% tax can become a very, very big number. So it's definitely important. And you've been stressing it, I'll stress it as well. It's definitely important that folks get ahead of the process, you're probably talking to that listing agent who's trying to get you to list the deal immediately. And I understand that, that we're always sensitive to time as listing agents, but it's important that people get their ducks in a row, because you never know what offer is going to present itself, and they're going to want a fast close, and then you're going to be up against the wall. So along those lines, we'll kind of wrap up with this. What's someone who owns a property, maybe they're thinking about selling, what's some of the conversation, or what's the first conversation you think they should have around this idea of going into something more passive like a DST?
Yeah, so I always tell people to think of what their goals are in their life, where they would love to spend more time. Many times people tell me, Andrew, I spent my whole life growing my net worth, right? I didn't really get to spend as much time with my kids, and now I'd like to spend more time with my grandkids. So that's a common theme. Or maybe they've never traveled, right? And so just start thinking of, what are you going to do with the money? Because I've also had clients say, you know what, I'm just going to cash out, pay the tax. They get faced that 40% tax hit, and they think, well, I'm still going to pay the tax. But I tell them, well, what are you going to do with that $1 million afterwards? Is it going to go in a CD? Does it make sense to pay all the taxes at once? Because sometimes what we'll do is pay the taxes over time, whether that's through them doing it's called a 453 installment sale, where they're carrying the note as a seller financing. Or maybe they do a REIT option with me, where they pay some taxes up front, they do the partial exchange, and then over time they just sell out chunks out of the REIT as they need. Sounds like there's an ambulance going by. I don't know if you heard that. But there's a lot of options. You must be
in downtown San Diego.
Yeah.
We're used to it when we're talking to folks down there.
Yeah, no, exactly. So it's all about kind of planning out, what would you do if you had more time, right? Would you pick up another hobby? Would you spend more time with grandchildren? Some of my clients tell me, Andrew, life's really good for me right now. I like this concept, but I don't know if I need it yet. And that might be the case, but sometimes what I tell them is, well, when the problem arises, or if you'd like to try out DSTs, you can always try it out with your problem property, right? Most of my clients have more than one properties, and they usually have their trophy asset that they don't really want to ever sell, and then they have other assets that they're like, well, the one by the college has been a headache, or we are doing a renovation right now, or the timing's coming up, my tenant's moving out, and that might make sense to be the first one to try the DST with. Or other clients have told me, Andrew, I like all my assets, but I know I'm going to need this. Let me just try out $50,000 into a DST, give it 3-4 years, see how it performed for me, and then in the future I'm going to revisit selling my properties. Most of the time they usually come back to me in a year and a half, but that is those are situations I come across all the time. So it's really figuring out, what are your goals, what would your dream life be, because we're only on this earth at least for so many years.
Excellent advice, Andrew. Absolutely. It all comes down to time. What do you want to be doing with your time? Do you want to be dealing with the telephone calls, or do you want some more travel? Or what I like to say is tranquility. So time is your most valuable asset. Well, Andrew, thank you for joining us today. Again, I wanted to bring Andrew on because I know he has a lot of good information. We had to keep it very structured today, but I'm going to put Andrew's contact information down in the links below. I highly recommend that if you're thinking about these options, going more passive, reach out to Andrew, schedule a meeting with him, reach out to me, I can connect you with Andrew. And again, one more time, we have to remind you that this discussion was intended solely for educational purposes and should not be considered tax, legal, or investment advice. Please, 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 please consult your own professional advisors regarding your specific circumstances. Andrew, thanks again. I'm Doug Tabor for Going Passive. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, everyone.